information is where FAC is. I believe we are at the Colorado room again, which is a great place. And next week's seminar will be a virtual seminar, so there will be a Zoom link for Dr. Johan Dutoit. So that will be a virtual seminar. And then any other announcements? No announcements? Okay. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Matt Pendrayev, who had, basically he has the distinct pleasure, or maybe disadvantage, of being my first ever graduate student in this department. But having, he was really sort of instrumental in setting my whole lab on this fish passage career path, or fish passage research path. So Matt, I thank you for that, because that has turned out to be a really interesting and fruitful area of research. So he wrapped up a few years ago, I won't say quite how many years ago, and he spent about 15 years working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife as their aquatic researcher in charge of stream restoration, working on fish passage, looking at things like whitewater parks, diversions, doing monitoring, not just restoring the stream, but actually monitoring the stream. And I think he has done probably more to advance fish passage research here in Colorado than probably anybody, working with Eric, sort of his partner in crime. They've supported a number of my graduate students, and I really appreciate that. And he's also just a really fun guy to work with. I would not recommend wrestling with him. So, Matt and I have, we're somewhat different in age, but not that different in age. We sort of watched our kids grow up. We keep meeting at track meets and watch our kids run way faster than we ever should. But when it comes to doing work on streams, there probably is no one who can move material and do such a good job as Matt. So I give you Matt Pendrayev.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thank you all for showing up today. It's kind of cold outside. We've had kind of a weather shift here, but just really pleased and honored that I could be here on a Friday afternoon and kind of hopefully inspire you with some really fun and interesting wildlife research, fish wildlife research as we kick off the weekend. So as Chris said, I'm an aquatic research scientist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and the title of my talk is The Response of Trout Populations and Pool Depths to Large Wood in Streams. And I have to say I'm a little bit nervous because the last time I was up here I was giving my master's defense in 2003, so it's been a while. So before I get into the results of the study, I want to give us a little background in fish habitat. So I work for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which means I manage fish populations. So in doing that, one of the main responsibilities we have is how to improve fish populations. So there's a number of ways to do that, and the main ways that we do it in Parks and Wildlife, we can stock fish in streams. That means we can take fish that are reared in some of our great hatcheries across the state, move them to the right locations and place them in streams to artificially bolster or improve populations. We can also change regulations. So for instance, if we have a stream with a population of fish and the numbers of those fish, the population is, say it's a little lower than we like, we can try to improve recruitment by protecting the adult, reproductively mature individuals through regulation changes that would then allow those larger, mature, more fecund individuals to be able to reproduce and not get harvested. And then finally, we also can manipulate habitat. And the idea of manipulating habitat is, can we increase the carrying capacity of a system through some sort of tweaking of the habitat conditions. And that's what I'm going to focus on, that area today in this presentation. So I really like a real basic way of thinking of streamfish habitat is given by Schlosser and Angermeyer in their paper in 1995. And in it, they basically identify three main components of fish habitat for sustaining a fish population. And that involves, first of all, a population has to have the right habitat to reproduce, to spawn in. So we got to have spawning habitat. I'm going to focus on trout in this presentation. Here's a photo of a pair of brown trouts formed a red and spawning. In this case, the kind of conditions that these trout need are defined as having a certain size gravel material, is a certain range of substrate. They also need a certain range of temperatures, and they like to spawn in areas of the stream where the hydraulic conditions form upwelling or provide better oxygenation to the eggs that are in these reds. In addition to spawning habitat, they have to have food and forage. So those feeding habitats for trout, classically we think of really nicely coarse, kind of free of fine material riffles, and those riffles are home to caddisflies, stoneflies, mayflies, and other insects that can drift and then form food or forage for feeding trout downstream in the pools below. And finally, fish populations require some sort of refugia from environmental extremes. And so, for instance, some of these extreme environmental conditions can be man-made and some can be natural. In this case, this is a photo of a diversion, a man-made diversion, where we remove almost all the water from the system downstream, and it creates a artificial low flow situation. So where does a fish go in a situation like this? In order to survive these kinds of low flow conditions, there has to be some sort of refugia or deep pool, something downstream for them to escape these harsh environmental conditions. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we also have massive flooding in this state. This was a photo taken in Estes Park below Olympus Dam. If you were here in 2013, you all remember the massive flood that we experienced. These kinds of conditions are challenging for fish if there's not, in this case, a floodplain, adjacent floodplain that can be inundated. Notice the active channel where all the frothy, crazy, turbulent water is probably not the place where you want to be if you're a fish, but if you can get out on that floodplain that's to the right, that's a little more tranquil, lower velocity conditions that will help you survive an event like this. So if you have these components, they also need to be connected in space. Just because you have them in a stream doesn't mean that they're available. And the problem becomes if we have barriers to their movement, such as dams or diversions or culverts, they can form an obstacle for fish trying to exploit these different components of their habitat. The other type of consideration we think of when we're thinking about streamfish habitat is scale. And Dr. Fausch has a figure in one of his papers that I really like that shows the scale of habitat conditions ranging from watershed to microhabitat scales. And within a watershed, the different tributaries, different elevations within that watershed, there's different types of habitat components that a fish population exploit. Like, for instance, spawning habitat may be located closer to the headwaters of a watershed, whereas overwinter habitats where they can find more tranquil, lower kind of dynamic hydraulic conditions and better feeding will be located maybe in the main stem further downriver. One way to think about stream restoration and fish habitat is to consider limiting factors. And what I mean by limiting factors is often in stream restoration that involves fish habitat goals, we try to say we want to improve the fishery in some direction or move it in some direction related to the fishery. That's located, in this case, at the top of the pyramid, but in order to get to biology or tweaking the population, you should consider the physical components that underlay biology. So things like the hydrology of the system. Obviously, fish are aquatic, they need water, and there's pattern of flows that define their habitat. If we start changing those dynamics, that can alter the conditions for that population to survive. The same with hydraulics. Hydraulics is just the interaction of water with the stream bed and banks and the adjacent floodplain. If we start to change the channel geometry and isolate the channel from its floodplain, that changes the conditions that fish will encounter in the channel. Geomorphology, that's the topography of the river system, and physicochemical just describes water temperature and water quality issues, in many cases our legacy of mining with heavy metals. It's funny, early in my career, I had a opportunity to help work with CDOT on the North Fork of Clear Creek near Black Hawk, Colorado. They wanted to do a stream restoration project because they were doing a massive scaling project to basically going to get a massive source of rocks from widening the lanes. So we were going to do some restoration in the channel. The first thing that we did when our first meeting was talk about the goals for the project, and one of the first things I asked was, well, what are the existing fisheries in this reach? We went and dug through some data, and it turned out in a 5-mile reach of channel, there was a record of 1 brook trout in 5 miles. So we pursued a little further, and sure enough, there were a number of different mine contamination locations upstream that were causing issues, making conditions uninhabitable for these fish to survive. So we said, why don't we put the brakes on this habitat project? Probably want to invest more in the physico-chemical side before we move on. But it's just really important when you're thinking about restoration, there's other parts of, before you can get to biology, you should be thinking about other factors that will hold up that biology and support it. And then finally, fish populations are a good indicator of ecological health. And fish, as if you've taken any of the courses in this department, you know that fish are connected not just to the organisms that live within the channel itself, but they also are connected to things like the riparian vegetation, the terrestrial insects that inhabit that vegetation and fall into the channel. And these fish also can exert a pressure on the macroinvertebrates and the emergence that comes out of the channel to feed other organisms. So all of these things are connected. The neat thing is that fish are kind of a central part of this type of relationship, this series of relationships, and are a good indicator in some cases of what the overall health of the system is. So why should we monitor? Here's some reasons. First of all, fish habitat restoration is expensive. And if you are an investor investing in a restoration project, it just seems like an expectation should be you should know what the return on your investment is. If you were to put money in the stock market at your age and then you worked for 30 years during your career and never checked it, and then said, okay, I'm ready to retire, and now I'm expecting to have that money ready for retirement, that's not a very good strategy. And the same thing goes with fish habitat restoration. It's an investment. It should be evaluated. Also, there's less expensive management options out there that can improve fisheries, including passive restoration techniques like fencing restoration or riparian areas, or, like I mentioned earlier, stocking and regulation changes. And then stream restoration projects is rarely done. There just aren't, there's normally, when restoration projects are conducted, there's enough money to implement the project and barely enough ever to go back and ever look at what the results or outcomes of your manipulations are. And then people assume stream restoration techniques will improve fisheries often without evidence to back it up. And that's a problem because that can lead to practices in stream restoration that are done over and over and over again, and some of those are working and some are really not working very effectively. And finally, cost-benefit information on stream restoration techniques is often lacking. Part of that is because the rate of stream restoration, I think, is accelerating rapidly. People are getting very creative with different ways of accomplishing their goals and objectives for stream restoration, but part of it also is just a lack of attention given to monitoring. So for instance, I looked back at the 10 years of restoration work we'd done in South Park. I'm going to get into these different pool types in a minute, but when we'd done projects that were completely using non-wood pool restoration techniques, haphazard toewood techniques, and undercut techniques, I'm going to get into the details later, but the point is 3 different types of restoration strategies to accomplish the same goal, but notice that range in cost. From per mile. It can add up rather quickly depending on what you're doing out there. Okay, now to get on to my study here. Our study was conducted in kind of the central part of Colorado in South Park near a little town called Hartselle, which is just outside of Fairplay on Badger Basin State Wildlife Area. The thing that's really neat about South Park, if you've never been up there, we have over 58, Parks and Wildlife manages about 58 miles or almost 60 miles of stream access for the public. So there's a lot of great access to good fishing and streams in South Park. The South Park has had an interesting history and legacy. The area in South Park has a long history of grazing, both cattle and sheep. And also, it's a very fertile landscape, relatively speaking, at a high elevation that supports hay meadows really well. So lots of hay production. And in order, of course, to maximize hay production, you've got to get rid of willows because they're in the way. So we believe that there was at some point kind of a massive effort to eradicate willows in these floodplain areas adjacent to the river. And it's the middle photo just shows a picture from around the 1860s. But even by then, there had already been quite a bit of willow removal and eradication. In addition to those activities, we also have a legacy of mining. So if you've ever been to Fairplay and seen the giant piles of cobble to the east of Fairplay, those are all a result of gold dredging. That's a gold dredge in the center of this slide. And also there's also this legacy from the railroad. There used to be a railroad that connected Denver to South Park, and people on the weekends would come up to South Park in the summertime and pick wildflowers over the weekend and then ride the train home. So this Midland Rail, the thing about it is they built this large berm that I'm showing with the yellow arrow, and that burned up railroad grade is persistent throughout the valley and cuts off large portions of the floodplain, so they're inactive. So for this project, we went into Badger Basin State Wildlife Area and we did a basic fisheries assessment to see what limiting factors might be out there that are impeding the population from growing. And we identified overwinter habitat as a primary limiting factor for fish populations. And what that translated into was there was a lack of deep, large volumed pools. And our belief was that the creation and maintenance of deep, large volume pools would create overwinter habitat for large adult fish and keep them from migrating downstream to a nearby reservoir. So we decided to use this state wildlife area as sort of an experimental training grounds to try some different approaches to develop deep pools. And we used a variety of treatments, and I'm going to share some of that with you today from the results from this effort. But the proposed reach, it's located on the middle fork of the South Platte River. It's about 2 miles long, and it's just upstream of the confluence with the South Fork of the South Platte River. It's classified as a high width depth ratio C4 stream type in a wide terraced alluvial valley. And the vegetative community before we did restoration was primarily composed of Canada thistles, sedges, and rushes. Most of the outside bends had evidence of accelerated bank erosion and bank sloughing. And we began construction here in the fall of 2006, and we wrapped it up by spring 2011. Okay. So I have to before I go on any further, there's quite a debate in the restoration community. I love seeing some of my friends who are in the private sector in the audience. This is great. About whether it's wood toe or if it's toewood. And I actually have a good friend of mine and colleague, Eric Richer. We actually have had a couple clashes over what do we call this, because we each refuse to give up the way that we call it. So basically, I did a quick Google search to research wood toe and toewood, and when I looked up wood toe, I found that actually what comes up very at the top of the search is that archaeologists have discovered one of the earliest prosthetic body parts in human history, a 3,000-year-old wooden toe. So in my opinion, this kind of settles the debate, but I bet you Eric and I will probably have a conversation after we're done here today. So really, let me get back to being serious, but toewood, what is it? So toewood, it's just a term that describes the use of large trees, natural woody material, root wads, and limbs to stabilize the outside eroding banks of these lateral scour pools or these bends. They're used to, again, stability, to provide time for vegetation to establish on the outside bends, and also they're used to provide fish habitat, like you'll see. So some other examples of toe stabilization techniques used in restoration are things like toe boulder, toe rock, and riprap, all of which are alternatives using large wood. But again, toewood is kind of, in my mind, a little bit more useful in many contexts because wood's biodegradable. So eventually we'd expect wood to break down, although studies have shown that wood can remain intact for 70 to 100 years if it remains in constant contact with water. So they last for a while, long enough for vegetation to get established, But the idea is that hopefully it's a temporary measure until the vegetation can become established and provide the living stream bank that we need to, over time, take over. So I'm going to go through now the 3 primary types of pools that we constructed in this project reach. There's 3 different types, and I'm just going to go through them. They're really basic to understand, and then I'll show you the results of what I saw. So the first pool type was a non-wood, I call it a non-wood pool. It was, what we did was we would go into a location on an outside bend. We would shape the pool through using an excavator, and then develop a point bar, narrowing the channel, and essentially create a lateral scour pool with no introduction of large wood whatsoever. The second type of treatment we applied, I call a haphazard Toewood treatment. So in this case, we did the exact same thing that I showed you with the non-wood pool. So we excavated the pool, developed a point bar, but on the outside bends, we would weave stems with attached root wads. So these are large diameter, like ponderosa, conifer type trees with the attached root wads, and we would weave those stems into the bank and then backfill that area with material and overlay with vegetation. So here's sort of some more. These pictures are more helpful in helping you understand what it looks like. This is a crew of inmates that we used for 10 years from Buena Vista Correctional Facility to do our construction. But they're placing the large wood, and notice we're kind of crisscrossing it in like a almost a buck and rail type of pattern. This is what it looked like beforehand, this pool space. This is, again, them working on the large wood placement. And then after the large wood is installed, we placed those limbs and tops of trees and foliage as a layer on top of the large wood, which then we backfilled with topsoil. And then so this is what it looks like, a kind of a fisheye view of what you would see prior to introducing water. You can see this has got a lot of complexity. There's a lot of limbs and brushing material, as well as kind of a lot of nooks and crannies on the outside bend for fish to exploit from habitat standpoint. And this is then after we've transplanted sod mats and planted willows. So this is kind of what it looks like after. And then the last treatment type was another Toewood treatment, but we call it an undercut treatment. The undercut treatment is using a footer log, like a telephone pole, with these stems extending over the edge like in a cantilever fashion. And this is what it looks like when we're building them. Notice the inset photo, there's about a 6 to 7 foot long undercut bank that's formed by doing it this way. And then a series of quick construction photos. This is an overwide section of the South Platte. The thalweg, or deepest part of the channel, actually runs on the interior third of this bend, which is highly unusual but normal in an overwide scenario. So here's us laying out those logs. The excavators built a cofferdam for them to park on. What it looks like, kind of the end-on view of those root wads, and then the final product. This is just, oops. Maybe I'll have trouble because now my mouse isn't where I want it to be. That's okay. This is just showing a flood of in 2015. After the project was complete in 2011, we had a massive flood hit in South Park during snowmelt. And so this section, this project was challenged massively through this flood. And the good news is it really held up well. We did not have to do any maintenance after the flood. It was pretty impressive. So I told you we wrapped up in spring of 2011 with construction. What we did 10 years after we finished the project, we went back in and we wanted to do an evaluation of these 3 different pool types. So we classified all the pools within our project reach as either undercut, haphazard, or non-wood. Then we selected from the population of pools randomly sample size of 3 of each of those types. In 2 years later, in 2021, this year, we went in and repeated the exact same evaluation. The only difference was that in this section, we added 1 more treatment site. So we increased the sample size to 4, and we included 2 more treatment sites. About a mile upstream, we found a control site that was representative of the impaired condition prior to us doing restoration in the project site. So it's just an impaired site kind of that displays similar conditions. And then further upstream at the Tomahawk State Wildlife Area, we have reference sites that are representative of the highest potential of the stream in our estimation to support a healthy fish population and habitat. So our sampling unit was actually the run, pool, glide complex. So it's important for me to make that distinction. It wasn't just, if you're a geomorphologist, it wasn't just the pool, it was actually included the run and the glide. The run is the steep transition at the end of a riffle where the bed drops steeply into the pool. The pool extends around the bend, and then the glide is where the topography of the bed, you start moving uphill out of the pool and toward the riffle crest. And then we install block nets at the head of the run and the tail end of the riffle. And that is our sampling unit. So here's us at work. The way we did our sampling was we'd set up our upstream and downstream block nets, and then that blue barge down there is our shocking barge. It's set up to have 5 different electrodes. So we shocked with 5 electrodes, wade shocking, and what we would do is we would start at the downstream. We use multi-pass depletion methods to generate or to generate our estimates. That's what we're going to use. So we did at least 2 passes in each site. But a single pass was defined as one sweep from the downstream block net all the way to the top of the site to the upstream block net and back down again. And we did this because in our past experience for some of these very complex areas and streams, we tended to herd fish better on the downstream pass and herd them through that complex habitat into the lower block net and were more available for capture. Once we had completed our sampling, we would process the fish from our passes. We would look at each individual fish weight, length, and identify them to species. And so then, now I'm ready to get into what are some of the geomorphic variables that influence depth in this case. And that is, the metric we're using for depth is residual pool depth. So, before I go on, I need to define for you what do I mean by residual pool depth. So, if I was going to go to a stream and I was just measuring the maximum depth of a pool in a system, I would take the measurement from the lowest elevation in the bed in the pool up to water surface. But the problem with doing that is my water surface can change depending on the flow conditions. So if the flow is really low, I'm going to get a smaller max depth than if the flow is really high. The elevation of water surface is going to be higher. So to overcome that, we need to take the residual pool depth. And the way you can think of the residual pool depth is if you turn off the spigot, if you turn off flow in the river and all the water ran out of the pools and it's now static, it's the residual volume left behind that you take the max depth of. And that's defined as residual pool depth. So that's fine. We just turn the flow off in the river and we can go take those. Actually, in Colorado, that might be possible, but not normally. Anyway, so here's what we do. Residual pool depth, we take the maximum depth. Doesn't matter what the flow is that day, we're just going to take the maximum depth in the pool. Then we take the maximum depth that we get at the tail crest of the pool, or the riffle that holds the pool's elevation downstream. We subtract the tail crest depth from max depth to get residual pool depth. That's what I mean by residual pool depth when I'm referring to that in this talk. So what were the geomorphic variables that we looked at that could influence depths? First, we looked at pool types. So I mentioned we have control pools, non-wood pools, haphazard, toewood pools, undercut pools, and a reference section. We also wanted to see if just wood pools, the effect of wood pools, all wood pools lumped together versus all non-wood pools. In this case, the control, non-wood, and reference were our non-wood pools, and the wood pools were haphazard and undercut toewood treatments. Next, we looked at radius of curvature. The radius of curvature is just defined as if you took a circle, you're looking plan view overhead on the stream, and you take a circle, it defines the outside of the bend, and it intercepts the point of curvature, which is where you go from a straight reach and start making your arc to the point of tangency where you come out of the arc and go more into a straight reach. If you take the radius from the centroid of that circle, that's the radius of curvature. In the literature, it has been shown that the tighter the bend, the more hairpin turn the river makes, the hydraulic forces are able to maintain a deeper pool. So that's why we wanted to look at the influence of radius of curvature. The next variable we looked at was pool length. And the pool length was defined as the head of the run to the end of the glide taken at the center line of the channel. And again, our thought there was that if we had longer pools, perhaps those pools would fill more with sediment based on a longer pool, or they would evolve toward a compound pool, which is just two pools on a bend. In either case, we thought it might lead to shallowing of that pool. And then upstream riffle length was our other variable we looked at, which was just the length of the riffle that is immediately upstream of our pool. And the reason we thought that would be good to look at was we thought that the longer the riffle, perhaps that would make the pool depth increase or be deeper, just based on physics and momentum. But in reality, I wish I had used riffle slope instead, looking back. Okay, those are my variables, or and those variables I defined are covariates that are coming in the model results I'm showing soon. The next thing we looked at was geomorphic variables that would influence abundance and biomass. We looked at the same variables as I just defined, so I'm not going to go through that. But in addition, we looked at year, 2019 or 2021, to see if there were differences by year. And we used residual pool depth to see if that deeper pools would influence abundance and biomass. The literature has already well defined that for salmonids, deeper pools create better habitat conditions for salmonids. And then upstream riffle length, we wanted to look at that as well, because we figured that if you have a longer riffle, you have more surface area and more area for aquatic insects to occupy. Perhaps there'd be greater forage capacity for a longer riffle. So in our data analysis, the first step was to estimate abundance and biomass standardized per 100 foot of pool. We started by estimating our detection probabilities using MARC and a Huggins closed capture model. And we modeled our detection probabilities as a function of fish length, fish weight, and pool type. Then we rolled those detection probabilities into our estimates of abundance and biomass and standardized those on a per 100 foot of pool basis. Biomass was estimated by taking the population estimates that we generated and multiplying those by the weight of our fish samples for that site. The average weight of fish. Once we generated our estimates of pool depth, abundance, and biomass, we used AIC model selection to determine which covariates would best explain the variability in the data. And we are interested in looking at abundance and biomass for brown trout, rainbow trout, white sucker, and also total fish abundance. The reason we're most interested in brown trout is because recreationally, most anglers that's the most available recreational species up in South Park. Rainbow trout their wild rainbow trout population hasn't really recovered in this area yet, so there was very low densities. But we still thought, because there's some around, we want to see if there's any evidence of habitat selection. White suckers we're interested in because adult white suckers can sometimes be thought of as competing with juvenile trout life stages. So we wanted to look at what the potential unintended consequence of our work in the river might be on white sucker abundance and biomass. And then total fish abundance included all species beyond the rainbow trout and brown trout, which included long-nosed sucker, long-nosed dace, fathead minnow, and some very small numbers of splake. And so then what we did was we modeled residual pool depth, and the covariates that were used in the AIC analysis included radius of curvature, wood presence, pool type, pool length, and upstream riffle length. And so basically that was the gist of how we did our modeling for residual pool depth. I did forget to mention that our AIC model set included an intercept model and individual and additive effects of all these covariates. And once we'd run this analysis, the models were ranked by AIC scores and cumulative AIC weights were calculated for each model run to determine which covariate best explained the variability in the data for the residual pool depth, abundance, and biomass. So now I get to get into some results. So which factors were most effective at maintaining the deepest pools of the list of covariates that I listed earlier? Wood presence was actually the best explanatory variable in this case. Residual pool depth is plotted on the y-axis, and then wood presence on the x-axis, and you can see that there was an average difference of about 1.5 feet, 1.5 feet between non-wood pools and our wood pools. And these bars are 95% confidence intervals. So you can see also that the wood pools maintain consistently a residual pool depth greater than 3 feet. The next thing we wanted to see was what factors were most effective at explaining variability in brown trout abundance. And we looked at, again, that suite of different factors or covariates. And we found that pool type was the best explanatory variable. So brown trout, this is on the y-axis, the brown trout abundance per 100 foot of pool. And those wood treatments, Haphazard and Undercut Toewood, were no different. The confidence intervals overlapped, but we found that those wood-treated pools had about 2.5 times or so more brown trout per 100 foot of pool as compared to the non-wood pools. Now, interestingly, the blue line with the dotted line, that represents the estimate from the control reach, and the red line represents the estimate from the reference site. Notice that they're separated, and those dashed lines represent 95% confidence intervals. The interesting thing was our non-wood treated pools had lower brown trout abundance than the control. We think one of the reasons why is because when we constructed those non-wood pools, we had some bank sloughing that happened after construction, immediately after. So we lost the benefit of the undercut bank that was there, whereas many of our control pools still had the kind of the presence of an undercut bank. So that may be due to the difference in undercut bank. Our descriptive summary data for brown trout per 100 feet of pool is shown here for 2019. The number of brown trout per 100 foot of pool, notice that the wood pools were somewhere between 3 and 3.5 times more brown trout than the non-wood pools. And in 2021, when we repeated the study, we found similar results with almost 2 times more brown trout per 100 foot of pool in wood compared to non-wood sites. Those wood being the green bars and the yellow being the non-wood. So which factors were most effective at explaining variability in quality trout? Our anglers really want to catch big fish. So the fish that we're interested in are these fish that are greater than 14 inches in total length. And we found that residual pool depth was our best explanatory variable there. So quality trout greater than 14 inches is plotted on the y-axis, and residual pool depth on the x-axis. The yellow dots represent the non-wood pools, the blue dots represent wood pools, and the green dot includes an estimate that it was a mix of both. But as you can see, the wood pools all had higher abundance of quality sized trout than the non-wood pools. And if you notice, where that trend line intercepts the x-axis, it intercepts it at about a little over 1 foot of residual pool depth. Anything shallower than 1 foot of residual pool depth, don't expect to find any quality trout there. This is descriptive summary data showing abundance of those quality trout. And again, look at the wood pools were 6 to 7 times higher number of those quality trout than the non-wood pools in 2019. In 2021, there were 10 almost to 20 times greater biomass, density estimates for those quality size fish, comparing the wood pools to the non-wood pools. Next, I'll look at memorable trout. Memorable trout we defined as wild trout that were 20 inches in length or greater. That's a rare fish for this system. It's a small stream. But in 2019, what was that?
That's a memorable.
Yeah, it is. It would be for me. So I don't catch them that often. So in 2019, we only had 1 fish of all the sites we sampled. There was 1 fish that was 20 inches or greater. In 2021, 15 fish, 20 inches or greater, and all of them but one were found in our Toewood or large wood pools. So that's good sign and a good trend, and we hope that continues. Which factors are most effective at explaining variability now in brown trout biomass? So biomass is the total pounds of trout, of brown trout, per 100 foot of pool length. So again, looking at these variables, it turns out the residual pool depth was the best explanatory variable. And you can see, again, the influence of wood over the non-wood. The blue dots are the wood pools. It just blows it out of the water. Our descriptive summary data for brown trout biomass in pounds per 100 foot of pool, 10 to 12 times more brown trout biomass per 100 foot of pool in the wood versus non-wood pools. Oops. And then this is results for 2021, which just reinforced what we found earlier. So somewhere between 7 and 10 times more biomass, brown trout biomass in the wood over non-wood. So which factors were most effective in explaining variability in rainbow trout abundance? Actually, year was our top predictor, but that's not surprising because rainbow trout are stocked in the system. They move from somewhere else, but there's very low densities. We also did look, though, at rainbow trout biomass, pounds of rainbow trout, and it turns out that wood presence was our best explanatory variable. The y-axis is the rainbow biomass. Notice that it was 8 times higher in wood-treated pools than non-wood. Now, white sucker abundance, we looked at what would influence that. There was no clear variable. The intercept model. So what does that mean? Well, the intercept model is our top model. That means that regardless of any of the factors that we looked at, you had an average of 15 white suckers per 100 foot of pool. Doesn't matter where you are. So that really surprised us. However, so if you understand, the average for all pools was about 15 white sucker per 100 feet. When we look at biomass, wood presence, we had 10 times more white sucker biomass in the wood pools than non-wood. What does that mean? It means that even though we had the same numbers, we had all the big adults living in the wood pools. And then which factors were most effective at explaining total fish? Remember, that's all species combined. We found that wood presence for abundance per 100 foot of pool, we had 1.5 times more fish when we're looking at all species across the board in the wood pools and non-wood pools. And then our descriptive summary data, it wasn't quite as clear cut here. You see that the confidence intervals overlap between non-wood and our wood pools for 2019, and the same was the case for 2021. Which factors were most effective in explaining total fish biomass? It was residual pool depth So again, our blue dots are the wood pools, so you can see that those were clumping very much. You had way more biomass in the wood pools than non-wood. And then my descriptive summary data, the total fish biomass there, 10 times more total fish biomass once again in the wood pools than non-wood pools. And that's significant. And the same goes for 2021, we're somewhere between 10 and 12 times. So the last set of results I want to show you are really fun. It's a good way to send you in your weekend. These are before and after photos. In 2007, we went and took photos through the project site before we did any restoration work. I want you to pay attention, especially notice that in our pre-construction photos in 2007, not a single willow in the landscape. Now if you look at 2021, you can really see the difference in the habitat as it's starting to respond. This is what I mean by Toewood and the ability to buy time for vegetation to reestablish. The willows are starting to grow in on these outside bends, and notice the wood that now serves as habitat for fish. This is a before and after from 2007 to 2021. The willows have exploded here. Another photo point. Kind of the photos, just I'm not going to say much. They kind of speak for themselves. This is another point where the fence is obscured by these willows now. On this photo, just notice the difference in substrate of the stream. You can see a coarsening of the substrate in the post-construction photos. After that period of time, we have probably way more suitable habitat for aquatic insects now through this reach. Even in non-wood pools, here's the willows before and after. and then better hydraulics through that riffle. So yeah, and it's just really encouraging to see the willows responding and the vegetation taking off. This is a riffle here that's now growing in. So in summary, large wood treated lateral scour pools created and maintain the deepest pool conditions. And where white suckers are present, large wood treatments might have unintended consequences of boosting biomass if you're concerned about interspecific competition with younger trout life stages. And then wood presence was associated with increased abundance in biomass for rainbow trout and the total fish present within pools. And finally, wood is good. If you catch anything today, hopefully that message was communicated. Wood is good for increasing brown trout population metrics, regardless of the construction type, whether it was haphazard or Toewood. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people because I just cannot tell you how many people were involved. I had several different crews of inmates that I worked with over the years doing these construction projects. Tyler Swar, the current fish biologist, my mentor Rod Van Velsen. So anyway, I do want to focus on a few individuals from CPW. Tyler Swar, Eric Featherman helped me with data analysis. He's my statistical guru. Jeff Spohn, Eric Richer was invaluable, helping me with designing the study. Many aquatic biologists, technicians, and volunteers. Is Matt here? There he is. Yeah, Matt, I had a couple photos of you in there. And then my research technicians, Casey Kyle, was very valuable and helped me develop the presentation. Sam Graff, Matt Robinson, and Mallory Algier. And then my mentors from restoration, Rod Van Velsen, who was my predecessor from CPW, Dave Beitelsbach and Dave Rosgen had helped. So that's it. You guys have any questions?
I had two questions. First, I was wondering if you have any theories as to why the wood did better. Is it because of potential things that it caught in it, or the shade or space for the trout to hide that made them be able to grow larger?
I think you nailed a bunch of them just with what you said there. The wood provided complexity, added complexity to those pools, but it also helped maintain deeper pool depths, which if you saw in those results, pool depth seems to be very important to sustaining those larger adult fish, those adult trout, in particular during low flow conditions for low flow refugia. And when we do our sampling, it's often in the fall during more low flow conditions, so that may be a contributing factor for why that trout habitat is so valuable. But also, yes, you saw the willows and how they're growing up over the wood. Now we have a whole new suite of insects that can colonize those areas besides just this plain old sedge rush community. We get the insects that colonize willows, the shading benefits from that, and then obviously the other benefits as well. So yeah, it's a combination of things. Probably most, based on my results, I would say the maintenance of pool depths was a critical component, or developing and maintaining those pool depths. Residual pool depths greater than 3 feet.
Cool. And then my second question
Yeah.
is just curiosity. How did you do the willow plantings? Was it from fresh cuttings, or did you do rooted willows?
So we did a little bit of each. Early in the project, we actually got our willows from Colorado State Forestry over here, and they did what are called bare root stalks. So they'll take the cuttings and stimulate the roots to grow, get those roots established. Then we get bundles that come out to us, and then we use the inmates to plant those on the outside bends with augers. And then after that, we didn't have money in our budget, so we tried cuttings. We went out and just cut from live stands, and then directly planted them in the ground. And we had really pretty good success, but not quite as good as I would say as the bare root. But it was good enough that we thought we could, and we just continued to use cuttings from that point forward. Pretty much that's our new way of doing it.
That's the practice we did in Eastern Oregon before I moved out here. The kind of restorations, it's like way cheaper.
Yes.
Just go to a well and cut 30% off of it and throw it in the ground.
Yes, and those plants are more adapted to the conditions that way too, I think.
You just gotta make sure they put it in the right way, because if you would put it upside down.
That's right. Gotta watch quality control. Yes.
Should there be beaver all over the place up there?
Yes.
Is that the next step?
I think so, but they can't get established if they don't have anything to eat. So that's why we're doing this. Is we're getting willows reestablished. These stands are growing in, and hopefully, we'll start to see more beavers coming in and occupying these habitats and creating more diverse, kind of multi-threaded habitats. And also just, they back up water, they create better conditions. It's a positive feedback for willow growth. They dam up water, fine sediment deposits behind the dam blows up, all that exposed fine sediment is now suffocating the sedge rush that was there. And then now willows can come in and start sprouting and taking off in those dried out areas. Yes, Boyd. Or I'm sorry, yeah, Boyd.
Whatever.
Okay.
Matt, good job.
Thank you.
Do you think that the treatment areas themselves are growing larger fish, or are they acting as more of a sink, drawing in large fish that are already in the system?
That's such a good question, and it's the classic question, and believe it or not, I once asked Dr. Fauch that same question when I was doing my master's degree in the copy room here. I don't know if you remember that, Kurt. We had a good conversation over there. Let's see, Phil Roney wrote an article in Fisheries about 2 or 3 years ago that was addressing this very question. And I think that's the best place I would say to refer to really get a complete response. But that is the question, is like, at what scale do we start to improve carrying capacity overall on a more population level scale? It's got to be bigger than 2 miles, in my opinion. But the point is still a good one of, what are we doing? Are we just rearranging the chairs on the deck of the cruise liner? Or is this really moving the needle on carrying capacity? But I liked what Kurt told me years ago, because I've never forgotten it. What he told me, and I think this is a very important thing to recall, is first of all, how many times as an angler have you gone and fished in a location, you pull out a fish, you're fishing, you pull out a fish, and then you go back the next week and there's another fish there and you catch another one and you remove that fish from the system. You go back the next week and so on. Those fish have to come from somewhere. So if a fish comes in and occupies a new preferred habitat location, it had to be somewhere, and wherever it was occupying prior to it moving in is now vacant. So another fish can come in from somewhere else to occupy that space that's now allowed. And as you know, with trout, there's sort of a dominance hierarchy with larger individuals selecting the best, most profitable locations. So if those large fish are removed, the idea is that I think as based on the theory of a hierarchy, the new next kind of big fish will move in from somewhere else, potentially leaving another unoccupied place somewhere wherever that fish was making a living before. So I think that's an acceptable way of seeing things. I'd be curious if Dr. Fauch has any new, since that was way back in 2003, so I don't know if his views have changed. Dr. Fauch, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a form of the answer that I still would give, is that if you felt, because people will argue this, that, okay, all you're doing is concentrated fish, right? And if you believe that, then you're really not believing in the first principles of population biology of salmonids, because you would then believe that if you removed a fish by fishing, it would never be replaced. So, to me, that made sense. I do think that with advent of pit tags and antennas, you could study this question correctly, but it would take that kind of scale. The question I had was, I wasn't paying full attention to your data for your reference site, but it looked like that was always like way higher even than the rest of your treatments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in terms of putting wood in pools, it's great. I loved your results. I almost thought they were almost boring in a good way, because there were some.
I'm sorry.
It's great, but there's not a tree in sight.
Yes.
Paul's point about beavers is a good one. So in the future, I guess 2 questions. One is, what is it that created the habitat, do you think, for the fish in your reference sites? Why was that so good? And was that also the similar alluvial channel with no pine trees within a long distance? So that's the question. And also, once these pools form more naturally, let's say you've taken the grazing off and things take a while to establish, the willows get going, you're gonna have a lot of non-wood pools created by willow undercuts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that gonna be similar to the reference sites? I mean, wood is good and you create it and that's wonderful, but your long term is to have the system either through beavers or its own willow and lateral scour and alluvial channel and multi-foot channel. How's your thinking on sort of the future and also what your reference sites were like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reference site that we chose was actually a bounded alluvial valley. And the reason I look back at the selection of that site, and I think it might have been a slight mistake, only a sense that when we do electrofishing in the fall, it's a highly attractive site for our biggest individuals and also a nursery ground for those, obviously, the fish that are hatched out of that system, because there's fantastic upwelling. And as you know, so a bounded alluvial valley is where, think of an hourglass if you're looking down on a valley. You have a wide alluvial valley upstream. It goes through a very concentrated kind of point where geologically the bedrock or geologically kind of nicks down into a narrow section, and then it widens out again downstream. So what that forces is the groundwater to come nearer the surface, and then we get really great conditions for spawning, and it attracts salmonids to that location. So so one of the confounding factors, or one of the problems I had is my selection. I tried to pick the best reference condition based on our fish data, but there is this sort of anomaly a little bit with it being a bounded alluvial valley. But to answer your question, the vegetative community, because of the groundwater effect, it's unbelievable. There's all kinds of great willows, beavers present, some multi-thread channels, and then we have spruce and ponderosa nearby on the banks that actually do fall into the channel to contribute some large wood. It just so happens that the pools that we selected within the reference reach didn't have appreciable amounts of wood in them, because in general, large wood is not something that's very common in that landscape. The other question you had about whether or not it's justifiable to use wood, I think, is totally a good question. The reason we kind of thought wood would be a good treatment kind of material was because it is biodegradable, and over time it would break down and also potentially become dislodged, move downstream, become habitat somewhere else. But the concern that we had is, how do we get willows established? The rates of accelerated bank erosion in this setting without woody vegetation is unbelievable. You can't just directly plant willows on an outside bend in the present state when it was just before we restored it and expect those willows to grow. It seems like competition with sedge rush and just the accelerated rate of bank erosion doesn't allow that to happen very well. So we thought about wood as a compromise, but you're right. I mean, I think we're still, ideally, we'd like to have something that would function better from a restoration standpoint if we could create something more like a willow that holds an undercut bank. That just becomes a little bit more of a challenge, and it takes more time, but it can be done. That's the answer I have for now.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
One final question.
Oh, yes.
Well, it's a two-part question, but do you have a hydrology standard for floods that you build your structures against, like 50, 100-year floods, or?
We don't in this case, because we don't have any infrastructure really nearby. But if you saw my slide in my video, I'm so sad that it didn't work. We knew it would probably do that with a split screen. But the flood that hit us in June of 2015, it was a bank full, I believe it was around 375, somewhere in there, and the flood flow was around, was it 500, something like, it was higher, 580.
600.
Yeah,
So
just shy of
it's been
600.
600 year
Yeah,
flood?
so it was about not quite twice bank full,
Well,
but it was a big flood. It had most of that floodplain, as you saw, is inundated, and it really, I think, was a good test for those treatments, the wood treatments. What was the second part?
Well, a long time ago, I took a graduate seminar here. William Platts, S. Platts came, and he was a research biologist for the Forest Service based out of Idaho, and he was big on habitat and fish density, and that's what I followed him through the literature over the years. But essentially, before he retired, he essentially renounced all his conclusions.
Oh.
And I don't understand who he talked to or why he did that. Does anybody-
Oh, I don't know.